Thanks, Rachel. Good to see you again. And thanks everyone for joining us on this beautiful day. It's really my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and collaborator, Dr. Stephanie Schwartz. We're really lucky to have her. Stephanie is Associate Professor in History of Art at University College London. Her writing has appeared in many eminent journals, including October, Oxford Art Journal, and Art Margins. And she's contributed to many edited volumes as well. I'd just like to highlight the key special issue of Oxford Art Journal dedicated to the legacies of Paul Strand. Here in 2020, she published her first book that you see with its really great cover, Walker Evans, No Politics, a major new and sort of a hinge point, a major new study in Evans' work, which we'll learn a lot more about very shortly. With that, I'll turn it over to Stephanie, but please join me first in welcoming her virtually, but also in congratulating her on this huge, huge achievement. Many of us have been waiting for this text for a long time, and it's a massive accomplishment. So with that, Stephanie.
Thank you, Kevin. That's a really generous introduction, and I very much appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation to you and to Rachel for inviting me, because it always is a nice thing to be able to talk about the work that you've finally finished in some way, and kind of continue to rethink it and think about the way in which it to have a conversation about it. So that's really what I was hoping to do today, is just really present a kind of overview of the book, some of its main arguments, leaving time for conversations and questions. So what I thought I would do is, really the best way to start is really to investigate or address the book's title, or my decision to frame the book as an act of refusal or negation, this idea of no politics, that I really wanted to use this as a frame, which was certainly risky in some way, and wasn't necessarily, as many of you know from publishing the first title, but one that I became increasingly committed to as I was getting close to finishing the book. Risky for probably some of the reasons that you could imagine, or I'd be interested even to hear what people thought about the title when they first saw it. As some people have said to me, it's absurdity or even shocking, given the ways in which or the ease with which art historians have come to claim politics for art and artists, and given the need for artists to announce their politics. And so I settled on this title in part because I wanted to engage some of those claims, or engage that kind of provocation. But the other reason why I did it, and I just wanted to, this is just a scan of the introduction to the book, and apologies for all of but I don't really actually have a PDF of the book except this one. But more specifically, it's because I organized the book around a series of refusals, and you can see here that the introduction to the book is actually titled Refusals. So I wanted to kind of indicate that idea of thinking about history in the form of a refusal, and so that's what I do kind of in the book. And so in a way, and I know this is not an Evans, but I will get to why I'm choosing this in a second, I want to structure this presentation around these refusals, and I've chosen 3 as a way to just kind of give us an overview of what it is I was trying to do in this book, or to highlight what I think is one of the most probably straightforward but also important refusals, which is my refusal to write a history of American documentary that either celebrates or denigrates its politics. In many ways, this is the standard narrative, and it has been since the 1980s, when in the wake of the Cold War and the rise of postmodernism, American documentary was somewhat debunked, when it was deemed too liberal or too voyeuristic or too untrue, and so forth. These are some of the common ways in which documentary, and especially work by people like Dorothea Lange or Walker Evans, was being discussed. So these are the kind of now familiar characteristics for a type of work that Evans and his contemporaries in the US were doing in the 1930s. And I use this Lange photographs here in some way to stand in for this, partially because it is one of the most canonical photographs from this period, or from the American, what we understand is the kind of American documentary project, one that's so familiar, been reproduced so many times. where it has both been celebrated and denigrated as a kind of good and bad politics, as a photograph that gives space, gives the space of representation over to a migrant, but also is seemingly voyeuristic. These are some of the ways in which this work has been and still has been discussed. And so the politics of photography and the photographer have come to kind of overdetermine the history of documentary. And we're kind of, what I saw was that we were stuck in this kind of either or bind with the way in which documentary was being discussed. And the more and more I looked at Evan's work and more time I spent with it, I felt that it actually compelled us to write a very different history of the form, or to think about writing history differently. And so that's really what I tried to do with the book. So as I said, I'm going to outline kind of 3 refusals that I've kind of pulled out for today's presentation. And the first one is simply this kind of no politics. What does this statement mean? So as you probably know, this is not my statement, it's Evans's statement. It was voiced, or at least penned, by Evans in 1935, in which he said, "No politics, whatever." The 3 words close a memorandum that Evans wrote in 1935 about his employment with the Resettlement Administration, that New Deal agency that hired photographers to record the US government's response to the Great Depression, their efforts to get Americans, quote unquote, back on the land or back to work. And I'm showing you here just 2 of the many photographs that Evans produced while he was working for the Resettlement Administration, or the Farm Security Administration, the FSA. He produced, hundreds of photographs as part of this archive. And these are somewhat typical of the kind of work that he did, and probably familiar to many of you, in which he's focusing on people in place, thinking about architecture, not just the body, but of buildings, and the different ways in which he's kind of mobilizing the frame in his photographs. I think we can see something that has become kind of typical of Evans's work, or probably this is an even more iconic, now classic kind of Walker Evans. So in assessing his decision to work for hire, Evans said this, or wrote this to himself: "Never make photographic statements for the government or do photographic chores for government or anyone in government, no matter how powerful. This is pure record, not propaganda. No politics, whatever." And so Evans was not just insistent, but he was emphatic. He, ended this statement by writing "no politics" in all caps. And so, as you can imagine, scholars have spent a lot of time thinking about this statement or phrase, or at least it's in almost every discussion of Evans' work, it kind of comes up. For some, it's simply taken as a fact about Evans, that he's not a political photographer, that he's not like his contemporaries, Ben Shahn, for example. So I'm showing you just one example of a Ben Shahn photograph, also made for the Resettlement Administration a little bit later in the period, by the time Evans wasn't really working for the FSA anymore. Or we could say Dorothea Lange, photographers who worked for the FSA and were public about their left political leanings. And of course, in making these pairings, I've pointedly tried to bring together photographs that actually don't show much difference between the photographers who are making them, regardless of their political affiliations or their claims. So, Shahn and Evans, who were very close friends, were making very similar kinds of photographs. Or a more kind of established way to argue this is to compare him to the work of the members of the Film and Photo League, American facet of the kind of communist wing of American documentary, the workers from the Workers' Relief International Relief Organization, which you see here, recording their fight against fascism, rent hikes, and evictions in the early 1930s. Evans, wanted nothing to do with this bunch of photographers, and he even complained when his work was instrumentalized by this for League work, which happened a couple times. So that's one way in which this statement has been made, but more often than not, scholars have simply refused to take the statement seriously. They simply disavow it by saying that the photographs in Evans are political, and this seems to most to be a given or even obvious. These are records of impoverishment, of racialization, of economic depression. They were made as propaganda for the US government and so on. So these are the ways in which that statement has been kind of denied or negated. And so in the book, I wanted to not only take the statement seriously, take seriously Evans' refusal to work or act politically, but more importantly, I wanted to take seriously or think critically about this idea that we need to disavow the statement, so to kind of disavow this disavowal, and what it tells us about the ways in which we have historicized documentary or written its history. And one of the arguments I make, or like what the crux of the argument in the book is, which is a bit, I think probably one of its most established arguments, is that if we don't take the statement seriously, if we simply just disavow it and say that, well, he is a political photographer, these photographs are political, we fail to actually historicize what documentary is. And to say this is not to discount all of the work that has been done on documentary that historicizes as a product of the New Deal or as an invention of the liberal state designed to organize a people into a nation, because these accounts are obviously very important and give documentary a history, a time, or a place. But my argument is that they don't necessarily historicize it. And what I mean by that is they don't take seriously the kinds of long histories of photography that Evans, or that I think Evans was tapping into, or that I argue that he was kind of tapping into. And I'm using this photograph here, which I'll explain in a second, which might seem out of place in the context of thinking about Walker Evans, but it becomes a kind of central, not necessarily this image, but William Fox becomes a kind of central figure within the book in a kind of interesting, or I hope an interesting way. So what I do is I try to insist that what Evans is doing with his disavowal by saying no politics is actually trying to historicize documentary, or just historicize photography. His demand for photography's pure presence, which is part of that statement, or as a pure record, recalls photography's past, its status as a negation of politics. Since its beginning, photography was deemed to be natural, to be the sun's work was one way in which early photographers put it, or neutral as kind of nobody's work. And so I'm showing you here just one example of this beginning, which I discuss at length in the first part of the book, a photograph that is said to have made itself. And so to quote the maker, the English inventor of photography, William Henry Fox Talbot, he writes, "This building is the first ever known to have drawn its own picture." And so this is the way in which Talbot kind of frames photography as a process that has no author, has no hand, has no, is a just kind of inscription of the world in a certain kind of way. And so since I spend a lot of time thinking about this idea, since the beginning, photography was deemed as a means of making images that required no interventions, no hands. It was invented as a way to compensate for the hand's labor, or an author, a subject, a will, etc. And so one of the things that I try to do throughout the book is to think about what it means to discount this as myth, or just to claim that it's not true. And argue that we can't just do that. We need to account for the ways in which those myths or those stories were powerful. Or stated differently, disavowing these statements, or disavowing these statements necessarily discounts the statement's cultural necessity or the necessity to repeat it. With his refusal, Evans, I argue, was mining this history. He was reminding us of the need to mine it in the wake of the nation's rapid industrialization. So what I try to do in the book is really put documentary in relation to these kind of longer history of photography, in which photography was being thought through as a kind of register of a kind of no politics, of no hands, no labor, no mediation. Despite the fact that this is a kind of mythical construction, what's the cultural impetus for this myth, and why would this myth reemerge so prominently in the 1930s, or even in the 1960s, as I will look at in a second. So throughout, particularly the first part of the book, I chart all of the ways in which Evans continues obsessively to play around with this idea of a kind of what he calls a no operator. It's a term that he comes up with in 1931 to talk about what photography is. Photography is the kind of, specifically photography in an American context. He says that, photography is at its best in an American, where it's most natural is when it has no operator. And so I'm just showing you here some examples of the way in which he maps this out across his work through the kind of earliest work, which are these photo booth portraits that I use for the cover of the book, in which he's thinking about, the ideas of mechanization and the making of a portrait without a hand in a certain kind of way, or the kind of the mechanization of photography, or this very famous photograph that appears in his book, American Photographs in 1938, which he made of a kind of the kind of school portraits or the kind of, commercial portraits that one makes. And then finally, another kind of important example is this spread that he does for Fortune in 1946 called Labor Anonymous, in which he sets up a tripod at a street in downtown New York and across from a kind of blank hoarding and just photographs people as they walk by. And he sees this as part of a project of investigating this idea of a pure record, because he claims that he made no choice. The people just walked by and I took the pictures. And again, it's not so much that this is true or not, because he admits that obviously this is not, I did make a choice. I chose which photographs to put on the page, etc. But that he's constantly investigating this kind of relationship between photography and its kind of embedded or kind of ghostly history of this kind of, no operator, no politics, no hand. And so I look at various forms of the way in which he does this in the first part of the book. Here's just one other, I think, significant example, and this is probably one of his last photographs, or, this is 1973. He was given a Polaroid, one of the new Polaroid cameras, and he made thousands of photographs with it very quickly. He was kind of obsessive. And so again, he's thinking about thinking about mechanization, thinking about automation continuously throughout his career. And so I look at Evans's work and think about documentary in relation to this kind of problematic. And this photograph is also where I end the book, which is why I wanted to kind of bring it in here. So if the book begins with a kind of series of refusals, or thinks about the idea of refusals and takes no politics as seriously as a kind of refusal for the hand, the author, the subject, a kind of will, I close with what I call remakes. And so I close the book with this photograph, in part because I'm interested in how he continues to think through this kind of problem of mechanization or this problem of automation, but also because this photograph is in many ways a kind of remake. And so this is the kind of second, what I'm calling a kind of remake. And that's how I'm not sure if you could see that, but that's the title of the coda. So the book goes from these kind of refusals to remakes. And so this kind of frames what I'm thinking about today as the kind of second refusal. So if the first one is no politics, the second one is something along the lines of, these aren't as formalized in the book, but something along the lines of kind of no ends or kind of no returns, of thinking about the negation of a certain kind of model of history that has become very established within the history of documentary. And so one of the things that I try to do in the book is try to refuse to write a kind of history of the rise and fall of documentary as well. This is another kind of established narrative within our histories. Like the celebration or denigration of politics, there's also a narrative structure about the rise and fall of documentary. So on the one hand, the history is written to suggest that a new, better, or more political form of documentary emerges in the 1970s, when artists are no longer tied to the state or a kind of liberal politics. And for those of you who are very familiar with histories of photography or even American photography, the examples would be kind of Martha Rossler and Alan Sekula, and a whole group of photographers who were working in the context or in response to, say, the Vietnam War would be one example of this. And so that's a kind of narrative structure that has been kind of set up that I really try to challenge within the book. So if on the one hand you have this kind of move to the kind of, a kind of a better example or a more political example of documentary. On the other hand, you have this idea that Evans kind of sold out, that after the FSA project, he took work for Fortune magazine, which was one of the three important illustrated magazines that was established by Luce, or the Henry Luce kind of empire, which for many is seen as the kind of, voice of corporate capitalism. And so there's been very, established narratives of this idea that Evans had this kind of political moment for these kind of 18 months when he was working for the FSA. And then after that, he kind of sold out in a certain kind of way. And a lot of histories of photography in this moment are written within that kind of narrative. And I do spend a lot of time in the book talking about his Fortune work, or his work as a kind of working for these magazines, specifically in the third part of the book. But I'm just showing you here is some examples of the work that he does do for Fortune, which is quite incredible. He's not just working as a freelance photographer for Fortune, but he becomes in the 40s hired as a kind of special photographic editor. They create a job for him, and he works at Fortune through the 1960s, both writing and making photographs, designing, doing layout. He, does it all. He's very dictatorial in a certain way about, how he worked, and was a kind of nightmare for everyone else working at the magazine, because he would cut and crop his photographs at will. He wouldn't leave space for bleeding, or all of the ways in which a magazine is produced. He didn't necessarily think about. He just thought about, this is what I want to do with the photographs. But what I'm trying to show you here is that he was doing this from the 1930s through the 1960s. So he already was hired and working freelance at Fortune in 1934, the year before he was hired for the FSA. And he continued to do this well into the 1960s. And so in some way, this narrative of him kind of, moving from a kind of political documentary project to Fortune doesn't really hold up, because he was continuously doing this throughout his career. So I'm interested in kind of questioning some of those kinds of established histories that we kind of have in place. But in terms of thinking about this idea of a remake, one of the things that I try to argue as well in the book is that he doesn't necessarily, I don't think we can necessarily, I try not to think about the work as a kind of progress, that it somehow advances or gets better or falls off between the 1930s and the 1960s. And actually that what he's doing is continuing to kind of work through and work on the same kind of problematic. And this spread from 1960, I think, shows that a bit in terms of he's still working around the same kind of questions. And I don't talk about this so much in the book, but I have published on this spread elsewhere. And so it is a kind of important mark for me. But we can see this as well in this Polaroid shot. So the reason why I choose to end the book with this and to think about this idea of remakes is because this is also, it's not just a kind of Polaroid and a kind of return or thinking about this idea of automation, but it's also a return to one of the most important sites of his early work, which is Hal County, Alabama. So in 1936, Evans went with AG for Fortune magazine. So they were hired by Fortune to do an expose on white tenant farming families, which, as many of you might know, was never completed or published, or was rejected by Fortune. And then AG spent the next 5 years turning that into this tome called Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which opens with 31 photographs by Walker Evans of the families in Hal County, including the homes, the architecture. And so he goes back to Alabama in 1973 and makes this Polaroid photograph. And so I'm interested in the ways in which he kind of returns to these subjects, or doesn't really give up those kind of problematics. And in 1960, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is reissued again with 31 additional photographs. So it has 62 photographs in it. And so there's this constant reworking, remaking of his work throughout from the 30s to the 1960s. Another kind of classic example that I also spend some time in the second part of the book, where I talk a lot about portraiture, that's crucial here, is this series that he made in 1938, or between 1938 and 1941. For those 3 years, every winter, he got on the subway in New York with a hidden camera, with the camera kind of in his coat right here, and took photographs of whoever sat down across from him. And so again, he saw this as and he writes about this in several different drafts of an unpublished text about this as a kind of example of that no politics pure record as well, that he just sat there and recorded whoever came across from him. And again, he talks about the ways in which he's making categorizations and selections, but he's still working through this kind of problematic that he started thinking about in 1931. But the photographs are not published until the 1960s. So they have this new life in the 1960s, and they get taken up by a whole new set of photographers. And so this becomes a kind of, for me, it's really interesting to think about how we've historicized Evans' work, and how we, things that emerge in the 60s become kind of read as if they were there in the 1930s, and these kinds of problems as well. So I look at these different kind of ways in which he holds on to work and work gets published later, and how he kind of jockeys between those kinds of decisions, those kinds of choices. And so in terms of this kind of second refusal of kind of how I organize the history and try to refuse to write this kind of use the book, you know, a monograph on Walker Evans to kind of start in the 30s and move to the 60s, I explicitly, and I write about this in the introduction, kind of refuse to do this. And so the book is organized completely thematically. And in each section of the book, or each part of the book, there's 3 parts: American histories, late portraits, and yesterday's news. I work between the 30s and the 60s back and forth kind of constantly to kind of just muddy some of these ideas that, you know, there's some kind of progress here, or some kind of development in his work, and see what that would do to the way in which we kind of think about documentary. It's also a bit of a refusal to just kind of hold the artist in this art historical container of the kind of life of the artist as a kind of platform for how we want to you know, how we would historicize or write about the work. But the other reason why I do this, which actually I realize makes it difficult book to use for teaching, is that I also refuse to kind of say, like, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is here, and the Subway series is here, and I don't keep them contained. I write about them in each different part of the book, which goes a bit against the grain of the way in which we, you know, we want the kind of, you know, to contain this work as a kind of work on its own. And part of the reason, I mean, I did that somewhat unconsciously when I was writing it, but I realized while I was writing it, one of the reasons why I did that is because that's what the work kind of tells us to do in a certain kind of way. Because he doesn't necessarily contain one project and kind of seal it up and finish it and kind of move on. In almost all of his book projects, there's these kind of overlaps and, you know, moving between the different kinds of projects. And so I try to take that seriously as well, and try to think about what would it mean to say that these are not contained works, kind of finished works in their own right. And that one of the things that he's trying to get us to see about documentary as well is that it doesn't have this kind of, you know, it's not singular in that kind of way. It's not kind of self-contained. And so I make this argument that we need to kind of think about these books as kind of open, you know, these open-ended kind of projects. And so that's part of why I want to also work against this idea of kind of, we have the 30s, the 40s, 50s, 60s, and we can kind of follow this trajectory through his career, but also just think about how the work doesn't necessarily settle into these nice, these kinds, you know, that it isn't self-contained in that kind of way. One project seems to kind of flow into the next or open onto the next. And so what I'm showing you here is one example of this, a kind of very easy one to kind of see, is this, the book American Photographs from 1938, which was actually made, was published, as you can see, through the Museum of Modern Art. And one of the things that I don't write about this in the book, but one of the things that I have learned recently or realized recently is that we often thought this as a catalog for the exhibition of Evans's photographs that took place at MoMA in 1938, which was the first major retrospective, which was the first ever retrospective of photography at the museum. So although there was a very important show of photography in 1937, in 1938, this was the first idea that you would have a retrospective of a photographer and establish this as an artist with a career. And it's always been kind of understood that this was the catalog for that show, but in fact, the book came first. The book was made, and then the curators at MoMA said, oh, we should have an exhibition kind of celebrating this book, as opposed to the kind of other way around, which I think is kind of interesting for thinking about how important these books were within our histories of photography. And so Evans makes this in 1938, and what I'm showing you here is just 3 pages from the book, and I'll maybe talk about it a little bit more. But you see that the first photograph is a photograph of a policeman from Havana. And so this was a project that I'm going to talk about just in a second, that he does a bit earlier, and that he then mobilizes in this other book. And so again, there's all these ways in which photographs from one project kind of bleed into another and kind of get taken up in all of these kinds of different ways. And so I really tried to kind of take on board what the work was showing me or doing in terms of kind of thinking about how to write about it. And so this leads in some way into the kind of third refusal, the third and final refusal, if we have this kind of no politics and this kind of no end or no returns in a certain kind of way. The third one, which again, I don't formalize this as well in the book, but we could think about as a kind of no photographs. And what I mean by that is that much of what I do in the book, and this made it very difficult to get images and get image rights, was that I refused to publish the photographs as photographs. Almost every single illustration in the book is a page spread, which as far as copyright go becomes very difficult, because then you have several rights holders for each image, because it's not just the Evans photograph, it's the publisher, and then there could be multiple photographers, on each page. But I was committed to this as a kind of project, maybe naively so, and I don't know if I would ever do this again. But I was really committed that when the reader looked at the photographs, they weren't just looking at photographs, they were looking at page spreads, they were looking at layouts, they were looking at the work, which is the book or the page or layout. I work through all of these different kinds of ideas. And to suggest that that's what documentary is, that we can't just say there's, the photograph is documentary. It's the whole, it's this whole editing process that he kind of goes through, and even push it so far as to suggest that documentary is not necessarily like a lens-based practice, which is, I think, one of the things that we just assume. It's film, it's photography, it's video, it's lens-based, especially within a kind of contemporary conversations about contemporary art. But I think one of the things that Evans and a lot of, and I'll talk about this in a moment, photographers from this moment were thinking about were actually, they didn't think about it in that. It wasn't they were refuting this, they just didn't think about it in that way. And that oftentimes in most of these projects, it was these processes of collaboration with novelists, poets, sociologists, a whole range of different cultural workers, in which photography was just one of the graphic forms in which people were working. And so I try to really kind of think through that. So just briefly, because I realize I'm going on, but I wanted to just show some of this work, because it's probably the work that is least known, although it is increasingly becoming more known by Evans, which is his first major commission in 1933. And this is actually where I start the book, and for me was one of the most important projects. So in 1933, Evans was hired by this publishing company, J.P. Lippincott, a Philadelphia-based publishing company, to illustrate this book, The Crime of Cuba, by a journalist named Carleton Beals. And for those of you who are familiar with American history, might know who Beals is. He was an incredibly important journalist in the 1920s and 30s, writing for The Nation, incredible anti-imperialist exposés about Nicaragua, about Latin America and U.S. relations with Latin America at this moment. And so Evans was hired to illustrate this book. Interestingly enough, the model was Margaret Burke White, the photographs that she did in Russia. That was the plan that the publisher had in mind. It didn't really pan out, but it's interesting that that's the model that they wanted to use. So the book was published in 1933 on the eve of a revolution that overthrew the then president Gerardo Machado. And I do spend time in the book talking about this, but I'm not going to go too much. But just in brief, Machado was basically known as the Mussolini of the tropics, or as you can see here, I hope, on the cover of Time magazine, Cuba's Mussolini. So Beals was writing in this moment and writing about this dictator and thinking about the crimes of Cuba in relation to the reign or the rule of Machado, who instituted a whole range of what we could now think of as kind of quote unquote fascist policies of, outlawing labor unions, closing the university, suppressing all newspapers, the gambit of what we would imagine as dictatorial rule. He also had a secret police in which very famously they instituted a Spanish law from the colonial days, which is called the law of flight, the practice of shooting prisoners in the back upon setting them free and then charging them with attempted escape. And so when Beals arrived in Cuba, it was the middle of a revolution. There were bodies in the streets, there were major uprisings, protests. as you could imagine. And interesting enough, the crime that Beals writes about in this book is not just Machado's crime, but the US crime. And so he imagines Machado as a kind of product of US imperialism. And so the book takes its title from this claim that he, from one of his, someone he was, this is a university professor in the street, that, that basically the US stole independence from the Cubans who were fighting a revolution against the Spanish. And obviously I don't have time to go into the long imperial history here. But Beals was basically then put on a CIA list of the most dangerous, one of the most dangerous journalists. He was considered to be a Bolshevik. You got the kind of whole political history here. And so Evans is asked to go to Cuba and record, and illustrate this book. And he produces a set of what I argue and see as kind of very quotidian, everyday, kind of quiet photographs of life in Cuba. He doesn't record any aspect of what's happening in the streets, the revolution, anything that Beals is kind of writing about. We have photographs of portraits of stevedores, women, as he calls them, people lying and sleeping on benches, the cinema. He took about 400 photographs while he was there. People waiting in line for a trolley, and then a whole series of interesting, photographs of lottery ticket vendors. And he created all these categories, and I found in the archive and his notes for how he kind of thought through these photographs. And so I was really interested in this project, obviously, because, on the one hand, it seems like this is, as many would argue, and people have written about this as a kind of explicitly as evidence of, well, this is a political photographer. He's, publishing these photographs and what's an kind of anti-imperialist screed. But to me, when I looked at the book, this is not kind of what I saw. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about how I write about it in terms of, what I've said thus far. And there's this quote that Evans states in the 1970s that I use in part of the book as well, in which he basically says, it was a job, I was commissioned, and I just wanted to be left alone. I'm not illustrating the book. And so I was, of course, very interested in that. Again, this kind of refusal, not just because he refuses to record the violence, but because he refuses illustration, or he says, I'm not making photography as illustration. I'm not referencing what's going on in the streets. And when you open the book, or not open the book, but when you get to his photographs, this is what you see. And so he publishes his he submits 64 photographs to the publishers, 31 are used, but he's very explicit about how he wants them organized and made. And this is 1933, so this is one of his first works. He was, of course, looking at all of European photo books from this period, and it wasn't as if he was doing this, without knowledge of what was happening in France and Germany at the time, which I spend a lot of time talking about in the book as well. But he publishes the photographs, one per double page spread. There's a title, a very generic title, and a number on the anterior facing page. They're all put into this portfolio at the back of the book, which appears in the book after Beals's entire text. It's appendix and index. So it's a completely separate section. So again, this kind of, I don't want anything to do with this book. I'm going to do my own thing, and it's going to sit alongside this book. So I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in this idea of photography, the way in which he kind of mobilizes photography here as a kind of playing around with these kind of relationship between a kind of specificity of photography of kind of this man on the street and these kind of generic categories that he invents to kind of house these photographs. And the more time you spend with the photographs, you could see that he actually was creating a kind of archive in which he could have slipped another photograph of another stevedore kind of across the page. And so he's working through this, essentially through representation, through the relationship between a kind of general and a particular, or thinking about mediation. And so this is one of the things that I also try to spend a lot of time thinking about, is that we've held on to this idea that documentary is about the kind of here and now, about a kind of immediacy, or we've debunked that that's not what it's about. But actually, Evans was working with completely different kinds of categories at this moment, kind of really thinking about documentary in relation to all, in relation to this this relationship between image and text and general and specific and these forms of kind of mediation, such that when he does decide to think about the violence, which you see in 3 photographs in the book, there's 3 photographs that record some of the students who were killed under this law that I mentioned. Those are not his photographs. He didn't make them. He took them from the archives of the local police. So he's re-photographing other people's photographs of how the violence has already been kind of represented. And so you find these in the archive as well, these photographs, and you can see how he kind of mobilized them in the book. And he just calls it a document of terror. So this kind of general, and he says anonymous photograph. And so he's thinking about, again, these ideas about anonymity and kind of, that I was talking, that I was kind of thinking a little bit about earlier. So, just this importantly is not, one of the things that I then do in the book is look at the way in which this was actually like across a whole range of documentary projects, this was a problematic that was being thought through. This idea of I'm not illustrating. We see it in Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, which is his next book project, where James Agee says the photographs are not illustrative and goes on to explain what the collaborative relationship is between the photographs and the text. We see it in another important book from the period, Archibald MacLeish's Land of the Free, in which he says, he plays on this idea of the poem, the photographs don't illustrate the poem illustrates the photographs, and plays around with these kinds of ideas. So it's kind of, within this kind of moment in the 30s, there's a whole host of photographers and journalists and writers thinking about photography in this other kind of way that I don't think has fully entered into the conversation about documentary. Another kind of example that I think through is a book by Edwin Raskin, who was actually the archivist for the FSA, and when she talks about this idea that layout is the most important thing within photography at this moment. It's not the photograph and it's not the words, it's actually this kind of combination between the two. The unit of workmanship has been altered, and he's, so it's this constant throughout the 30s, these different photographers and different cultural workers kind of thinking about this. Even the FSA photograph is thought in this way, as not merely illustration, but as a kind of new form of modern journalism. And I'm showing you here just a page from Dorothea Langham Paul Taller's book. And so these books were emerging in a way to kind of problematize or think through what photography is, or what photography's function is at this kind of moment, that I think exceeds just, I was here and I saw this and I made a kind of reference of this. It's just really playing around with these ideas of what a photograph is kind of supposed to do. And so before I close and kind of open it up for questions, I just wanted to say one other kind of minor refusal that I don't even really talk about in the book, but I think is kind of explicit, is that, I kind of refuse in a way to kind of move outside the canon, which for me is really important. And I don't say that lightly, but I feel like we're constantly being thought to kind of, like empty out the canon. And I think, of course, that is important. And we need to kind of add new figures and new histories to it. But I feel like one of the things that I really try to do in this book is actually just write history differently, as opposed to just kind of expand it or say, okay, we have this over here and now there's another history that needs to be kind of put alongside it. And to really kind of shake up some of the established histories that have been put in place by the histories that we have of the FSA. And the reason why I say this now or here in this context, because I also think this is one of the really interesting legacies of Martin Parr's work. And I know I've said really nothing about Parr, but just to close, I think this is really what one of his most important contributions to the history of documentary and photography, is in relation to his larger project, is to remind us to relook at these projects and really understand what a photo book is and how central it was to the history of photography. And in some way, we can't even, write these histories of photography unless we think about it in relation to the book project. And what he did with his collaborator across these 3 volumes is so amazing and such an important contribution to the history of photography, to really get us to kind of remember that the photograph is a kind of public form, and that its audiences are, you know, multiple and varied and public and private in all these different kinds of ways, and understanding what it means to have a photograph on the page. And for me, that's really what documentary is kind of about as well. And I tried to kind of make that really kind of central to the book. So yeah, I thought that's kind of what I have to say. I'd love to hear questions or comments or yeah, anything.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I'll just give you a little round of applause.
Okay, thank you.
It was really a treat and pleasure to listen to you frame your book. I wanted to open it up to anyone else. I have some comments or questions, but does anyone else have something on their minds? Just feel free to unmute yourself and speak. Casual.
I have a quick question.
Oh, hi, Greer.
Hi.
Stephanie. Hi, I'm Greer Muldowney. I teach photography in the art department. I'm not a historian, but I'm really interested in kind of if you get into his attitudes generally about politics more, because we're really talking about the photos and documentary itself. But I was waiting to think about like getting to like the list of contempt and like also working for Luce and his reactions to like Luce's, you know, the American Century and the Manifesto. And if that has a play into kind of thinking about him as a sardonic, like almost sarcastic figure in a way, if you have anything to say about that specifically.
Yeah, sure. Great. Yeah, I think it's really important. I mean, one of the things that I do feel that he's doing is, you know, he is kind of giving a send up to people who are just kind of claiming their politics and saying, you know, I stand for this or I do that, this kind of signposting in a way. And that's part of what this endeavor, whether it's sarcastic or parodic or a kind of, you know, so that he wants to have, you know, nothing to do with that in a kind of way. And for me, I always understood, I mean, I do stay close to the photographs and I try to kind of see how he kind of plays that out in his work, not just as a kind of statement. And for me, you know, thinking through the kind of question of mediation was kind of part of that. So like any kind of political endeavor or any kind of is, you know, has to be understood through the way in which it's, you know, kind of presented to the public in a certain kind of way. And I think a lot of photographers are doing that. But in the third part of the book, I spend a lot of time thinking about news and then, you know, how he's working with news photographs, either in Cuba, but also with, you know, as a kind of, as an employee for Fortune, as you were kind of saying. And there is a kind of standard, you know, I mean, there's some really interesting cultural histories of Fortune and looking at like McLeish and Agee and all of the people who worked for Fortune that either, you know, try to push back against this idea that they sold out because they were working for Fortune or that it was the Depression and they needed a job, and looking at the way in which you can kind of work politically from the inside, that there is no way to kind of like step outside and say, you know, I'm going to be kind of outside the capitalist system and that's the way in which I'm going to have a kind of politics. And so there's some way working inside is a way to kind of negotiate that kind of system and have a kind of political, you know, but you have to kind of work inside to kind of change the system. So I do talk about that a little bit in relation to some of Agee's work and McLeish's work, that, you know, even though their work was constantly being rejected, whereas someone like Dwight McDonald just said, okay, I'm done. I'm not working for you anymore. You're censoring me. I'm not going to do this. Agee and Evans kind of insisted on staying inside. They just didn't, you know, leave. And, you know, for better or worse, one of the claims that I make that why Evans did this, and this, you know, is because, and this is how I start the third part of the book, is that for him, it was a dream job. He controlled everything. It was the only job that he was going to get where he was going to get to publish everything he wanted, write whatever he wanted. they just gave him carte blanche to do, there's a letter from the editor to all the other people working at Fortune that literally says, let Evans do what he wants to do. This is a special job, which I'm sure, upset a lot of people. And so, although most people see it as a kind of compromised position, I see the compromise as kind of, he makes the most of it in a certain kind of way and still kind of works from the inside. So I don't talk explicitly, I don't try to kind of frame his politics, because one of the things that I'm actually trying to do is question that. I think what he's trying to do with this kind of no operator and no politics and kind of distancing himself from is to question that very idea that we can claim our politics, that we can kind of own our politics. And in the 1930s, that was a kind of when in some ways you were being challenged to really do that, to take a side, to like have a position on the Depression, on Roosevelt, on the war. What would it mean to kind of do a send up to that in a kind of way? I don't know. Does that answer your question a bit?
I think so. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't, if anyone else, and feel free to interrupt me, but I wanted to add, beyond your amazing work on Evans, what really intrigued me, and I know we've talked about this a little bit already, Stephanie, is the method, the historiographic ways of thinking. I mean, you ended your talk with a kind of meditation on how to write history differently. I really appreciated that, by the way. But you talked sort of in the middle of your, maybe I think it was about part 2 of the book, you talk about Evans' oeuvre as a sort of recursive kind of structure, right? Where it's not linear, it's not teleological, it's not like he starts here and gets better and better, or kind of has a parabola and the late work is bad or something. You have this, the thematic approach that you structure your book by kind of speaks to this, that there's certain questions that he keeps returning to. He returns to certain work to sort of replay them, rethink them. My question is, like, did thinking through his oeuvre in that way teach you or change the way you think about how artists structure their career or their trajectory, or how we as art historians or photography historians should think about the shape of an oeuvre? Or was it specific to Evans? Like the temporality?
Yeah, I think part of it is specific to Evans, but one of the things that I mean, this is going to sound like, a bit absurd, but one of the things that I was just thinking, that I constantly kind of, is that the 30s to the 60s is such a short period of time, right, historically speaking. I mean, people who work on the medieval work on like these, 200 years is like, and so I was really thinking about that a little bit in terms of the kind of, and it comes actually from reading about photography, from like a kind of, I mean, this is a kind of line within like Soviet factographic work of like, why is the human figure taken as the framework for, or the life of the human taken as the framework for the ways in which we have to write a kind of history, and what does it mean to kind of center the, so in that sense, it did make me think a lot about the ways in which we historicize and why, the life of the artist becomes that kind of framework. And of course, loads of people have kind of challenged this, but one of the ways that I do it in the second part of the book is to, which I'm sure very familiar with, or I know that you are, is thinking about this concept of lateness, right, of this idea. So I call the second part of the book late portraits, and some people have taken me to task on this, people who who have read the book and I've had conversations with, because I'm using that in a very to try to kind of argue that Evans itself, and in some way documentary, is already late in a certain kind of way, because it's just remaking, he's reworking Ache, he's reworking Zander, he's reworking Vertov. It's not this kind of, so it's not late in the sense of his life, but late historically. Yeah. And that part of the problem with one of the things that he's doing, or what I find so kind of mesmerizing about his documentary project, is that it's not about this kind of immediacy presence, it is about the kind of that idea of having already done it, already seen it, which goes totally against the grain of what we imagine his project's supposed to be. I was there in Cuba, I was taking this photograph, but that book is a kind of weird replay of Ache's Paris.
Yeah.
If you, when you kind of, or he's, he was looking at Zonder, because in 1931, he writes this very important review of Zonder and Ache and Rangor-Pach. He does Benjamin's, the same exact book that Benjamin's writing about, and so he's very familiar with those kinds of models of history as well, or like thinking through those kinds of models of history. So yeah, I mean, I also, to answer your kind of question, and I didn't talk about this because I thought it would just go a bit too far, is that the book actually ends not with Evans, but with a reading of the work of Alan Sekula. So I look at Aerospace Folktales, that's Sekula's 1973 work, in which he remakes that double, this double portrait that Evans, I think he remakes this with his parents. Sekula remakes this photograph with his parents, standing against their garage in California in the 1970s, explicitly, saying, I was looking at photo books and I decided that I need to remake this because I need to think of what this means now. Like, what does it mean to think about class in this kind of way? And so I end the book actually with Sekula, and so that's what for me was what I realized, is that it's not as if we have to go back to the 30s to understand what documentary is that we have to have these kinds of recursive histories that we can look at it through the 30s, through the 70s, and learn from the legacies that it provided. And so there's always going to be this kind of back and forth, and that it's not just about kind of, if I understand what was happening in the 30s, then I could really know what this work is kind of about, because what the work is about is also about what it taught us, what it did in the 70s that now lets us see the 30s the way we, that we can't remove ourselves from history in that kind of way.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like you're taking Evans's lead a little bit too in his formulation of the no operator idea, and the way in which, as you said earlier, like the human life isn't the unit, it's something else, or it's this whole this whole like constellation of technologies or objects that should probably guide the history that we're writing rather than the life itself. Anyway, I really appreciate that. Also, that aspect. Yeah.
I think I do, obviously when you spend so much time thinking about a single figure, even though in the book, obviously I write about a lot of other practices that, you become a bit obsessed and maybe myopic in a way too around these kind of phrases and these, but for me, that was a kind of very key phrase that already in 1931. So it wasn't something that he looked back and that he already established, that photography is really about not having an operator. It's not whether that's true or not. It's just that as a cultural manifestation, what did that mean in 1931? I was,
It's interesting that he then explores that through the Polaroid. I mean, it's so awesome.
I knew you would like that.
Yeah, I mean, and that he got obsessed with it, and everyone seemed to love it at that. Anyway, it's really cool.
No, he took like hundreds of photographs and just went around, because he was at Yale at that point teaching, and he called it his toy. And he just. But I do find it really interesting that of all the things that he did, is that he said, okay, I'm going to go back to Alabama and I'm going to and that they become so weird because they're small and colored and almost kitschy, but not, I don't know. They're very bizarre objects.
Something weird and self-reflective on that.
Yeah.
Any last questions for Stephanie?
No, so I want to say thank you so much, Stephanie, for joining us this afternoon. This was a really great talk.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
And thank you to everybody that joined us, and thank you, Kevin, for also bringing Stephanie to us and for introducing her and sparking that conversation at the end.
Thank you everyone who came. Thanks, Stephanie, and see you soon. Talk to you soon.
Okay.
Thanks, Rachel.
Thanks, Rachel.